Forget frequently asked questions.
Common sense, common knowledge, or Google.
How about advice from a real genius? 95% of people in any profession are good enough to be qualified and licensed. 5%
go above and beyond.
They become very good at what they do, but only
0.1%
are real geniuses. Richard Jacobs has made it his life's mission to find them for you. He hunts down and interviews geniuses in every field: sleep science, cancer, stem cells, ketogenic diets, and more. Here come the geniuses. This is the Finding Genius Podcast
with Richard Jacobs.
Hello, this is Richard Jacobs with the Finding Genius Podcast. I have two guests today. One is James Salzman. He's the Donald Bren Distinguished Professor of Environmental Law with joint appointments at the UCLA School of Law and the UCSB Bren School of the Environment. He's the author of Drinking Water, A History. Then I also have Michael Heller. He's the Lawrence A. Wien Professor of Real Estate Law at Columbia Law School. He's the author of The Gridlock Economy, How Too Much Ownership Wrecks Markets, Stops Innovation, and Costs Lives. And they're collaborating, looks like in this new book called Mine, How the Hidden Rules of Ownership Control Our Lives, coming out March 2nd through Doubleday. So, Mike and James, thanks for coming.
Absolutely.
Pleasure to be here.
Yeah. Well, before we get into this new book, can you each give me a little bit of background on yourselves and what your interests have been leading up to this new book?
Sure. So I'm an environmental law professor, a tree hugger, if you will, and been teaching property for a number of years. And when I was sort of the Drinking Water book was just, it was a lot of fun to write a popular book about drinking water. And I was looking for a second popular book to write. And a friend of mine said, it's funny that there's never been a Freakonomics book about property theory, because Freakonomics really is just microeconomics with some very, very clever and arresting stories. And I realized you're right. You know, no one's written a popular book focusing on ownership. And I knew Michael personally by reputation. He's one of the world's leading authorities on property. And so I said, if I'm going to do this, I got to do it with Michael.
So this is Michael. That's a very nice lead-in, Jim. Thank you. It's been so much fun working with Jim. I've been teaching property about ownership for 25 years. And what I've always loved about teaching is having students see that just a few very simple rules drive a very complex world. So when Jim and I started thinking about this book together, we realized that the same was that we could actually make that visible to a much wider range of people. So the genesis of this book was seeing how we could make clear just how simple the rules of ownership are that actually drive everything in our daily lives. So that's the goal for this book.
Okay. Did you guys fight over who's going to be on the cover first as the first author and the name and all that? I'm just kidding.
Having a last name that starts with S, I've always just said, we'll just go alphabetical.
I got you.
That's the rule in our world, pretty much.
Okay. Tell me, what are the, what's to be known about ownership of things and property? It seems like a pretty straightforward thing, but I'm sure it's not. So what are some interesting things about it?
Yeah, you're right. We think that, and we're wrong. So as Michael said, ownership is shaping every day of our lives, almost every minute. I mean, these are the rules that say who gets what and why. These are the rules that determine in everyday life, whether you're standing at the front of the line or the back. It's where you live, where you drive. These determine what we can watch and listen to. Hundreds of times every day. We don't even think about it, but we're encountering the rules that are going to determine who gets these things first. And it's true all over the world. So one of the things I think is pretty amazing is that in every culture around the globe, mine is one of the first words that babies speak. It's hardwired. You go to a playground, all you hear is mine, 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 right? And we assume, as you said, that ownership is natural, it's obvious, it's simple, but that's just not true. So let's go back to the playground for a second. There's a fight that breaks out, okay? One kid screams, this shovel's mine. I had it first. The other one says, no, I'm holding it. It's mine. What we hear is a fight of mine versus mine, but that's not really what's happening. What's happening is it's a storytelling battle. And each kid is making a different claim. One is saying, I had it first come, first served. Second one is saying possession is 9/10 of the law. And one of the key messages of this book is that remarkably, there are only 6 stories, only 6 claims to ownership that we use to claim everything. And it's not just kids. Businesses and governments do the same thing.
So what are the 6 claims?
Well, let me take that. So Jim already told you 2 of them, and they come up, all the time on the playground. I had it first. It's mine because I'm holding on. It's mine because I'm holding on to it. Is the second. That's possession. The third is it's mine because it comes from my body. So if you want to sell a kidney, can you sell it or not? That goes to the third claim of self-ownership. The fourth one is you reap what you sow. It's mine because I worked for it. That goes to the question, so for example, can 23andMe claim your genetic data because they work to assemble it? So 1 is first in time, 2 is possession, 3 comes from your body, 4 is labor. 5 is one that people don't know as well, but it's really a very foundational one, is what we call attachment. Mine because it's attached to something mine. So that one is, for example, can you fly a drone over somebody else's backyard? Is the airspace above the backyard attached to their home? And the last one is family. So a lot of ownership moves around on birth and death, marriage and divorce. So it's mine because I'm in the family. And those 6 claims, first, possession, self-ownership, labor, attachment, and family, those are the only claims that are available for everything in the world, for every resource, whether it's a shovel in a playground or whether we're talking about climate change or wealth inequality.
I've been thinking a little bit about platforms like Google, in their terms of service, Facebook, Instagram, et cetera. From what I can see, no one has time to read these things, especially if it's spur of the moment. You need to use an app and it's been updated. And ownership of platforms, what I'm seeing recently is like incredibly powerful because they set the rules, they change the rules, they amalgamate a huge amount of users, and then they can decide who to, keep or kick off or who to amplify. So how do you guys see the intersection of ownership and the 6 facets of it with platforms?
So Michael told you the 6 rules, but there's an important reverse message that the book talks about also, which is much of what we know about those rules are wrong, right? So possession is 9/10 of the law. Online possession is 1/10 of the law. So the example you gave of online, so when you go to the Amazon website and click on the, buy now, the book or whatever, maybe our book, hopefully, it goes into a shopping cart. And most people, polls have shown, think that you assume this is just no different than having a physical copy of the book, but that's not right. It turns out, and you were talking about these licensing agreements and such, for an ebook, was what I'm talking about now, you don't own it. Amazon can take it right out of your Kindle account if they want to. They've done that. Google can brick a home device that you've got. They've done that. You think you own it, but you don't.
One of the surprising things about online platforms is that there's a gap, and it's an increasing gap, between what you feel that you own and what you actually own. What you actually own today in the online world is much less and very different from what people believe they own. And what that point goes to is that ownership itself is a technology. Listening to your podcast and looking at older ones, you have such an interesting range of people focused on different aspects of technology. Maybe what's a little bit unusual about us on your podcast is that we also focus on technology, but it's a different kind of technology. We're not ourselves doing work with CRISPR, but what we're doing is the ownership work, the ownership technology that shapes whether or not you get access to the products of CRISPR. Okay,
so medical treatments, all this, I guess what you're saying and what I'm seeing is there's a whole complex chain of, it's not just simple ownership and access. Again, there's a lot of interplay. So a new medication, or let's take, the COVID vaccines. Access is totally unequal. The makers of it and the distributors of the vaccines, for instance, are prioritizing certain groups. And there's rights to get the vaccine, rights not to get the vaccine. Again, the different companies that own it, the distribution. So I don't know, it's just a complicated picture. When you look at these types of scenarios, like what do you see that others don't in terms of the dynamics of ownership and usage?
Well, it's a lot less complicated when you look at it through the prism of ownership. So ownership of COVID vaccines is actually no different from things that people are very much familiar with. So you're familiar with going to the deli and ordering a sandwich, right? It's first in line, step on up. And that's often the way we allocate scarce resources, first in line, step on up. That's not what we're doing with the COVID vaccine. There are increasingly back doors and side doors to get into access to the vaccine. And that's an example of what we call in the book, first come, last served. It's not true just for the vaccine. It's true across the economy that we're seeing more and more ways that the traditional way that people get ownership, in this case vaccines, from being first, is being switched by people who have control over that resource to something that looks very different, which is first come, last served. So when you see it through that prism, you see, I think it makes visible some of the inequality that is creeping into everyday life as more and more things across our everyday world move from first come, first served to first come, last served.
Before we continue, I've been personally funding the Finding Genius podcast for 4.5 years now, which has led to 2,700 plus interviews of clinicians, researchers, scientists, CEOs, and other amazing people who are working to advance science and improve our lives and our world. Even though this podcast gets 100,000 plus downloads a month, we need your help to reach hundreds of thousands more worldwide. Please visit findinggeniuspodcast.com and click on Support Us. We have 3 levels of membership from $10 to $49 a month, including perks such as the ability to see ahead in our interview calendar and ask questions of upcoming guests, transcripts of podcasts you're interested in, the ability to request specific topics or guests, and more. Visit findinggeniuspodcast.com and click Support Us today. Now back to the show.
And let me build on what Michael was saying, because there's another important point that comes out if you look at the COVID example, and that is that deciding ownership means deciding our fundamental values, right? There is no natural correct answer for who should get the vaccine first. Should it go to the most vulnerable, the highest bidder, biggest contributor to the economy? Any of those decisions is necessarily going to favor one value over another. How do we decide? Gets back to what we talked about originally. It comes down to a storytelling battle. Unions are arguing that their frontline health workers should be given priority. If we care about the vulnerable, prisoners perhaps should get frontline priority, and they should be ahead of the line. There are stories now that the wealthy are saying, look, let the market decide who gets to the front of the line. It's not clear that any of these is naturally correct. In fact, one of the points of our book is it's not the case that one is naturally correct. Ultimately, whether we like it or not, if we're going to decide who gets what, and if we're going to allocate a scarce, valuable resource, we have to come down to choosing a story. And the stories are out there for us to choose.
How do you establish fairness then? Out of these 6 basic underlying principles of, ownership and access, I don't know, what are like the prevailing theories? First come, first served, most needy, first served. What do you see takes precedence? What's working?
That's a great question, Richard. And part of our goal with this book is to make visible that that's the debate that we should be having. We don't usually get to even have that debate about who should get the vaccine or whether, Facebook can own your online clickstream. We don't get to that debate because someone tells us the answer is first come, first serve, or the answer is I'm holding on to the vaccine, so it's mine. And what we were hoping to do with this is to show you that when someone tells you the rule is going to be first come, first serve, that's a very powerful claim, but you always have the possibility of responding with your own ownership story. Well, maybe first come, first serve, but it's mine because I worked for it, or it's mine because it's attached to something mine. So part of our goal is to make visible that who gets the vaccine isn't a force of nature, that it is a choice, and that we think people should be having that debate. We're not the people who can tell you what the right answer is for who should get the vaccine first. You can have on medical ethicists on your show who maybe have some more insight as to that, but we want that debate to be happening. That's our goal.
The other thing, Richard, I think that's important to highlight is that by focusing on ownership, you have to focus on the owner, right? And the owner is going to choose the rule that maximizes what they care most about. So let's take a totally unrelated example. Okay, let's talk about the fast lane on a highway, right? So it turns out that in a lot of cities that have heavy rush hours, you've got this so-called HOV lane. And what's interesting is different cities use different criteria for who gets access to it. It used to be first come, first serve. If you get in the fast lane first, you can stay in it as long as you want. No more, right? So in some cities, if you're driving a hybrid or an electric car, right? So their goal is to sort of help with air pollution, promote renewable transport. In some cities, if you carpool with 3 or 4 more people, you get in. That's rewarding some behavior. And in some cities with congestion pricing, you pay. And that's rewarding basically wealth, saying if it's important to you to get there earlier, you can pay for it. The key point in all those examples, and our book is full of those, is that the owner has to decide which values are the most important. And then they use the allocation strategy to achieve that.
At what point, though, do we cross into a public utility or a public good, and the owners of a given platform or vaccine or whatever it may be, they're, the way they would do it, the way they would distribute it or allow access is taken over by, government or by larger needs?
Well, that's right, and that's the challenge we always have whenever any new science or technology or medicine or vaccine comes along, which is decide which what we call allocation mechanism, which allocation tool decides it. So you can decide it based. One version is you could have a lottery. You could do it on chance. You can do it based on an auction. You can do it based on first come, first served. And the question you're asking specifically is, should this be a choice that happens through the market? Or should it be a choice that's where it's individuals, bid for the resource? Or is it a choice that's, as you said, a public good, where you have a democratic process, a public process for deciding priorities? Both of those have pros and both of those have cons. But what's important is to notice that no matter whether it's public or private, you still have to make a choice about what is the value that you place the highest. And that ends up, for the COVID vaccine, being a matter of life or death. Whether we choose one group or the other.
Yeah, I didn't realize it's such a big topic without looking at it first, because essentially social engineering is the result of thinking about these questions of who gets what, when, and how. So it's got like huge implications. I mean, what's the zeitgeist in terms of allocation of resources right now? I know it depends on the thing, but
if you like this podcast, please click the link in the description to subscribe and review us on iTunes.
You said it exactly right, Richard, which is that ownership is at its root about social engineering. And part of what we want people to realize as you listen to this podcast or as you read the book is that ownership works, and it works very much like the remote control on your television, except that instead of which channel you get to, what show you're going to watch, the way ownership works is that somebody else, usually sometimes a government, often a business, it might be a parent if it's in the playground, but somebody else is choosing an ownership rule, whether it's first or labor or attachment or self-ownership. Someone else is choosing a rule that is steering you to do what they want. So one other way to talk about social engineering is as a remote control. And we see ownership very much as the remote control for your life. We want people to have the tools to be able to fight back when someone tells you this is the only way it can be. And the answer is, well, maybe, but there's another ownership story available that we also should be thinking about.
And another aspect of the remote control is we can use it to solve some of our biggest problems. I mean, sometimes more ownership is actually a solution. So, fisheries, you know the show The Deadliest Catch?
Yeah, I've seen it.
Yeah, so this is a reality TV show. Basically, these are these Alaskan king crab boats that go into the Bering Sea, and it's incredibly dangerous. When the show first started in the early 2000s, it was more dangerous to be a crew on one of those boats than to be on foot patrol in Iraq. Well, it turns out the reason for that is ownership. The way that the fishery worked was first come, first served. So basically, the season starts, and when the quota for that season, the total number of crabs that can be caught, is reached, the season closes. And so what it led to was a sort of Mad Max demolition derby on the high seas, where boats went out as soon as they could. Once the season started, fish as madly as they could, as wildly as they could, as quickly as they could, even if the weather was terrible, because if they stayed in port, the quota would be taken by other ships.
Oh, okay.
So what happened? So this idea actually came out of Iceland, then Australia, New Zealand, and finally Alaska got hold of it, and they said, wait a minute, we can create a new kind of property, and they're called catch shares. And basically, a catch share is an allocation of that year's catch. So it could be you're allocated 1 ton of king crab for this season. And what it means is you can hold on to it, you can use it if you want the crab, you can sell it to someone else. And so you're the fishing vessel. When the weather's terrible, you can stay in port. When the price of crab is low on the market, you can stay in port. Almost overnight, this ownership engineering made profits rise and deaths fall. And now this is the basis for sustainable fisheries management all over the world. And it's all about ownership engineering.
Well, I've heard there's lots of problems with it, too. I mean, the larger concerns buying up catch shares of smaller ones. So it's a lot less players in the market. And
Absolutely.
Some of the smaller fishermen are, they can't really catch much at all. And they, there's good and bad about it. But I've seen documentaries where there's quite a bit of bad, too. There's externalities.
You're absolutely right. There is there's not going to be a sort of a silver bullet. So some of the questions come up, and this happens all the time when you're talking about ownership. How do you allocate this new resource, right? So you've created this thing called catch shares, which is a share of that season's catch. Do you auction it off? Do you give it to the boats that caught that amount last year? Do you give it to a community and let the community allocate it? And if you give it to the owner of the vessel, they can sell it, but what happens to the crew, right? So none of these, I don't want to be heard saying that more ownership is going to be the perfect solution, but it's a lot better than people dying on the high seas because they're racing to catch as many fish as possible. And that's what the remote control of ownership was forcing them to do.
Yeah, I think some of the problems is that the attention paid to the ownership and use dynamics is punctuated. There'll be no attention for a while. You gave the example of fishing in Alaska. Then there's a flurry of attention. They put in this new system. Then attention, I think everyone sounds like, oh, it's been solved, and they forget about it. Then, unfortunately, people always are finding holes and cracks and ways to manipulate the system in place. And then it needs to be revisited, maybe revamped, on an ongoing basis, but that doesn't seem to happen. And then you get stuck with these systems that maybe they're just as bad, but different.
That's true for any technology, right? Before you had wooden fences, and then you have barbed wire fences, and you have better barbed wire fences. It's the absolute same thing with ownership. You have a new technologies, for example, for catching fish, and those technologies then become static, and then the problems and gamemanship around the technology becomes more visible, and then over time the technology changes. So ownership is never fixed. One of our really core points we want to get across is that ownership isn't a one and done choice. Ownership is an evolving technology, just like any other technology, and each iteration of that technology has pros and cons, and they're always in flux. And when you begin to see, for example, in the fishery example, that too many fishing crews are put out of business, you're not helpless in the face of that you can still make new choices and different choices about how technology should work for fishing and everything else.
And I think a key point, and Richard, you've already identified this. We don't tend to think of ownership as a form of engineering, but it is. It absolutely is.
Yeah, when you guys talked about the dynamics of ownership, I was thinking about like owning a house. Let's say I'm 75 years old, and now I'm on a fixed income, and my taxes keep going up and up and up. That's endangering my long-term ownership of the house, because if I can't pay the property taxes, then I'm not going to own the house too much longer. Or if you're in you have an HOA that keeps going up, so it's funny. I guess it's like when you own something, you got to be careful, because you may not. Things can happen that will endanger your ownership of it. So it's just, I don't know. It's a complicated issue.
But and as you just said, so on the homeownership example, as people get older, people worry a lot about protecting their homes, and in response to exactly that worry, a rising number of baby boomers in their homes, worried about how to stay. The real estate market developed a new ownership technology. They created something called a reverse mortgage instead of a mortgage, where the bank pays you every month. What people usually use it to live on, and it's basically a draw against the equity of your house. It basically is drawing down the equity, but lets older people stay in their homes for the rest of their lives. So reverse mortgages is a new ownership technology that responded to an emerging ownership dilemma, which was older people wanting to stay in their homes and losing them for exactly the reasons you said.
Well, I mean, there's this, I find myself, and I'm sure a lot of people do, in this new circumstance where these cloud platforms and just pay as you go and streaming is really attractive, but you're at the mercy of these platforms. They can cut you off. Like you said, they can brick your device. They can, you really don't own anything. If I have a social media presence, my accounts can be taken down. I don't own any of that. And in a society where maybe most or much of what a person thinks they own is, not controlled by them, that could be a big problem.
This is very much the future of ownership. When we look into the crystal ball and think, where is ownership going? One of the most striking features about the change of ownership in the 21st century is the shift from the ownership of things, from things that you can hold on to the ownership to basically a stream of services. So when we talk about ownership going from 9/10 of the law to 1/10, that's part of what we're talking about. We're moving into a world where you can stream anything and you may end up owning nothing. And that's a very different world. It's a very different world where instead of flipping through the stained pages of a cookbook and having a sense of connection with your parents and what they cared about, if instead of that you basically Google some ingredient or order something on Grubhub, your life is very different. Life is very different in a world where you lose connection with the sort of tangible stuff that made up our intimate lives. So your concern is a very real one, and it's something to be take notice of, that we're changing to a world of ownership that's much more ephemeral, a world where maybe you sort of rent your engagement ring or you lease your dog. And I don't think that's necessarily a world that most of us want to back into just by accident.
Yeah, I mean, even with transportation, there's all kinds of people talking about, oh, you won't need a car, you just use Uber or Lyft. It comes back again, actually, to this vaccine issue, which is kind of funny. Certain places want to mandate vaccines, and they say, oh, it's not voluntary, but you can't go to the store, you can't do anything without it. That's a potential scenario. So all the things that you think you may own, you merely have access to. And if there's ways to engineer that so that you can't have access to anything, if you don't do certain things that other platforms want you to do or government wants you to do, and that's very troubling.
When you think about what it means to be a free society and a free people, a place where freedom is born and dies is around ownership, around our access to resources. When governments want to destroy freedom, what they often do first is limit people's ability to own things, and then they take away ownership. So there's nothing really more fundamental to freedom than what you can make yours. And there's a real challenge to preserving our freedom in a world where everything is streamed and nothing is ours, where the Amazons and Facebooks and Googles can take back what you download.
It's a very different world when you basically own a stream of ones and zeros. And to a certain extent, and this is something psychologists will know more about than I, but I've always thought we're hardwired to a degree to think about ownership in sort of visceral, tangible, physical terms. And I think that we're sort of thrown for a loop. Our mental gyroscopes are sort of off in this new, increasingly virtual digital world because of that.
So I've seen some propaganda. I don't know if it's from like the World Economic Forum or who knows, but they talk about, in the future you'll own nothing and it'll be so wonderful and you'll just pay for what you need at the moment and little microbits. I mean, what's your thought about that future scenario? I mean, you're saying it, but what are some visions of the future that are likely, and what are some visions of the future that you guys personally would want to see?
Well, I think it's still playing out. I mean, I think actually we've moved past the sort of World Economic Forum high watermark of all you need is a service. You don't actually need the product itself. I mean, for all of these startups, that are supposed to provide the service for you, you don't need to own it. Almost all of those, as a percentage, have failed. Right? It turns out that people actually do want, in many cases, to own something, to actually hold on to something. So I think some of that we've realized, at least from my perspective, has moved into the sci-fi world. And there are some benefits potentially. I think what's interesting is that as an environmentalist, the argument that's often made is, look, this is going to actually reduce consumption, all right? Because you only need to use access to a car when you need to use it. On the other hand, if you don't have to buy something and instead you've got a smorgasbord that you can pick from, you may try to get something from every plate. And so it's not clear at all to me that overall consumption goes down even if you don't physically own each item.
Richard, this last part of the conversation that we've been having about the future of ownership, this is a part that's actually so important to us. One of the things we decided to do around this book is to make this part of our book available as a free download. So there's an ebook that's available on our book's website that is available for free that has this material, our thoughts on this material, on sort of how we can think as a free people about responding to a world where we're moving from owning tangible things to streaming.
It'll be ironic if you put it out there and then you suddenly took it back from everybody to give them a quick lesson.
No, we're not. I mean,
I'm just teasing.
Yeah, no, but our goal with this, Jim and I have both been teaching this stuff for a long time. And what really motivates us to do this book is these are ideas we really care about a lot and we feel people should have access to. And this last piece in particular, we really want people to not feel constrained by dollar to get access to this.
But there would be poetic justice if we took it back. You're right.
Yeah. Have you guys thought about coming up with it is a really important concept. I'm realizing that as I talk to you guys. I don't know, just an idea that came to mind is if you guys made a board game based on the rules of ownership so that people could really get a feel for different models and how it affects people.
Absolutely. We've thought about that. And the first one we came up with was a game called Monopoly. But unfortunately, that one's already been done. So now we're trying to figure out what's next.
Risk also was taken.
Actually, no, you know what you could do, though, is you could make maybe your own white-labeled version of Monopoly, but it has the 6 different ownership methods baked into it. So you could play the game using one of the methods, and you might have to call it something different. You might not, or you might have to license it. I don't know, but that might be a really cool way to use that existing platform and popularity to. So
absolutely, we're actually trying to think about. It's like a lot of what we try to think about is how to make complicated ideas like intelligible, and this is a piece of it. Is the ebook that we have online is a piece of it, and this interview is a piece of it. It's like how do you make things that seem like they're somebody else's problem and seem like they're too hard to get a hold of, have people realize that this is actually something that each one of us individually can have access to. Like you actually can be an active owner and reshape the world of ownership to serve you better, not just to be steered around by it.
The other part of it, and this is speaking as a teacher, is that there's nothing better than when a student has an aha moment. And one of the aha moments for this book, I think, for a lot of readers, is going to be learning that there are just these 6 stories. And remember that scene in The Matrix when Neo sort of bends backwards and things start dissolving into ones and zeros? Mm-hmm. And he sort of realizes, actually, this is just ones and zeros. If you get comfortable and start to look for those 6 stories, you'll see them everywhere. And a lot of conflicts will start to make a lot more sense, because instead of hearing mine versus mine, you're being unreasonable, you're being a jerk, what you really hear is someone saying, I had it first, versus I'm holding on to it, or I worked for it. And the nature of the argument becomes a lot less irrational. You can start to figure out what the base of the conflict really is, and perhaps how to resolve it.
No, this is really interesting. I just remember that I did hundreds of cryptocurrency interviews, a few years ago.
Yeah.
And with the cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin, they had proof of work. So in order to accumulate Bitcoin for some of the miners, they had to put in this computer work and expend resources to get it. And then there were some that were proof of stake, meaning if you owned a certain amount of the cryptocurrency, then you were able to make decisions of governance and, help the whole system run. So even there, it sounds like a bunch of these models are being tried out. It's like a testing bed for this kind of stuff.
The first one, the mining, they traces back, deep in American history. That's how the West was settled in the 1800s. The way you claimed ownership wasn't by buying it. It wasn't by being there first. It was by labor. The way you claimed ownership was by putting a certain amount of labor in over a certain amount of time. And that's how you got your homestead claim. So Bitcoin actually is following a very old and one of the just very few models that we have for how you claim ownership.
Do you think there's going to be a job description? I don't know what you'd call it, but a rights and ownership expert that companies that set up ecosystems and platforms will hire? I'm sure they have it already. I don't know what it's called, maybe an economist, but is there a name for this position, this thinking? It seems to be incredibly important to bake into the strategy of any large concern.
I think not yet, and that's one of the reasons we wrote the book. Ownership is diffused through a DIFF, through a lot of different roles. So part of it will be the lawyer who negotiates the contract. Part of it will be the marketing to decide how do we want people to own these things. Do we want to lease it? Do we want to sell it? Part of it actually is going to be the retailing experience, right? So one of the cool things we came across when we were writing the book is this notion called the Endowment Effect. I don't know if you've had podcasts about this or not, but it turns out there's a very strong universal psychological reaction that when you have something in your hands, it's worth more to you than if you just saw it before. So all these experiments basically where there are these 2 groups. One group is shown a coffee mug, the other group is given a coffee mug, and they're both asked how much is it worth. And the group with the mug always says it's more. How does this affect retailers and businesses? Well, they shape our shopping experience. So we basically get used to it. The Apple Store, take all the time you want, ma'am, sir, to play with the iPad. So it starts to feel like your iPad. And as that happens, the value actually starts to go up in your own mind.
We call this ownership engineering, and it isn't a position that exists yet in companies. It's not something that business schools teach people how to do. And it's not something that the company lawyers know is available. So part of what we are we're hoping is that the notion of ownership engineering, both from the business side, but also from the consumer side, becomes something that's available for increasing our enjoyment of the stuff that we do buy, making it more valuable, and having consumers understand better exactly what it is that they're experiencing when they're going into, say, an Apple store.
Yeah, what are the dynamics of people's usage of a free service versus a paid one? Because a free one, I'm sure that they can come to depend on it just as much as a paid one. And a company that provides a free service, let's say like Google Maps, it's now free. But what do you notice about the rules surrounding free stuff versus paid stuff?
Well, the way I sort of think about it is a bit differently, which is how companies use the strategy of paid versus free to grow their own products. So, for example, ever wonder about HBO and password sharing? I mean, every year we ask our students, how many have used someone else's HBO password? About 2/3 of the hands in the room go up. And then we say, do you know someone who uses them? And every hand goes up. These are law students, right? This is not sort of legal-ish. This is illegal, right? They're using someone else's password. The thing that's fascinating is that HBO not only knows this is happening and could stop it if they wanted to, but that they don't. And the former CEO, Richard Pepler of HBO, was very clear about this. He said, we want to create video addicts. That's the term he used. And the idea was, if we basically turn a blind eye and let what some people pay for become a free product for others, it's going to grow the brand. They know what they're doing is not exactly kosher. And in time, the hope is that they will become paying subscribers as well.
Another point, I guess, I'm sorry, Richard. So another point on the free is Google doesn't do it out of beneficence. They don't give you Google Maps. They do it because it's very profitable for them. And that's true for many of the so-called free services on the internet. As you know, they when it's free, basically you're the product, not the Google Maps. They are monetizing your use of Google Maps through tracking your click streams. And that's one of the most important online issues today is who owns that click stream. That click stream itself is extraordinarily valuable. It's worth hundreds of billions of dollars. Each individual person's click stream, your click stream, Richard, is worth over $100 per year to Facebook. So it's not really free. It's really a disguised form of ownership.
Oh, okay. I mean, if I use a free service so far, I don't really know how to harness my clickstream data. I haven't been told at all that it really has value. I don't even know how I get the value out of it, and it's being used already. It's, I don't know whose asset it is, Facebook or mine, let's say, but they're already using it and profiting from it. And that's because they actually, Facebook in particular, is extremely skilled at what we're calling ownership design. It's no accident that they're using it, and it's no accident that you don't know what the value is of your clickstream. One of the strategies for extracting value from the internet today is to assert ownership before the law clarifies it. People always assume that there must be a law on this, but often there isn't. If we going to mine asteroids on asteroids in outer space, who owns them? There's no law. And for your clickstream, there's no law. So what Facebook does is says, your clickstream is ours. It's ours because it's attached to our app. So they make a powerful claim of ownership, an ownership story, and people don't know that they can fight back. Individually, it's hard to. You can opt out of some of these, some of the tracking, but collectively, we actually have an extremely valuable asset, our intimate lives, that is being scooped up, vacuumed up by Facebooks and Googles and so on. And we have the opportunity right now, today, like this is a current live issue. Who owns your data? And there's no reason why it shouldn't be you.
In Europe, in fact, that's what they've done.
Oh, what have they done?
Michael, you want to go into that?
So in Europe, they have a different position. The starting position is the clickstream is yours. And if somebody else is going to monetize it, they have to come to you. And you can opt out of it. They haven't gone all the way. Their focus is more on privacy, but we can easily imagine one of our jobs as ownership engineers is to actually design new systems which go beyond the European system, actually also the new California system, and create mechanisms by which we flip the switch. Instead of it being they can use it unless you opt out, we could have the switch be they can't use it unless they pay you. Same is true for your genetic data. Right now, 23andMe is the reason that it's so cheap to get your genetic data, your genetic heritage decoded by 23andMe and Ancestry.com is that you're not really, their main client isn't you sending in your swab of spit. Their main client are the pharmaceutical companies that are buying access to your data. They basically give away the analysis of your ancestry in order for them to collect your information to sell to drug companies and insurance companies.
So it's a kind of spit bait.
This is very worrisome. because I'll give you another example. So I'm using my smartphone and I want to use an app, and all of a sudden it pops up and says, please say yes to the terms and conditions. I don't know if they've been changed. The document can be 30 pages long, full of legalese. I'm not going to read it. And if I need to use something in the spur of the moment, I just say yes because I just have to use it. And it's very, I don't know what you call it, sneaky. It's just disingenuous. I mean, the whole thing. And I just see this happening all the time in my own life and in other people's lives. And it's just, or what Facebook or Twitter, whoever does with your data, or 23andMe. I mean, I don't know. I don't even know what to say about it. But what are your guys' thoughts on all these?
Well, the first thing is to notice that it's happening. It's not just you who don't read those terms of service. No one does. I've never read them. They're impossible to read, and they're designed to be impossible to read. It's through those clicks that you're creating a new world of ownership, and it's a world of ownership in which individuals like you and like me have very, very little control. So the first step to taking back some of that control is to notice what's being done. That we're sort of through that sort of painless click, you're giving away much of what you previously would have owned in a more physical, tangible world. Now, that's not something that you can fight individually very effectively, but as people begin to realize enormous amount of control, of freedom, of autonomy that we're giving up in exchange for the Direction app or whatever it is, the more it becomes aggregated up to a political level where it does become something where we can be effective, where activism at the political level really can begin to make a difference on what are the basic rules of ownership for our online lives.
Michael's exactly right. I mean, this is ownership as citizenship.
What do you mean? Oh, say more about that. Ownership as citizenship? What do you mean?
It's exactly what Michael's saying, which is that individually, do you agree? It comes off my iPhone. I have no leverage, right? But if I understand what's going on and I can raise this with like-minded people and eventually with politicians, then those companies are going to take notice. If each of us basically says, ownership is given, there's nothing we can do about it, there's not another story to say, no, it's not yours because of labor, it's mine because of self-ownership, we can push back, not as individuals for some of these issues, but as citizens.
So, for example, I'm talking to you from New York. In New York, I have no rights in my clickstream, pretty much. Jim is talking to you from California. California last year was one of the first states in America to pass a digital ownership law that actually gives Jim a lot more rights. And when he clicks, I agree. And this is happening right now at a state-by-state level. Where you are, Richard, maybe a third rule. And eventually, collectively, we could have a national rule on this, the same way there is in Europe. But the point is that it's not a given. That's not the sort of background rule that of whatever Facebook or Google asserts isn't necessarily the only rule that's available. And states and countries and individuals can make a difference.
I mean, what do you see as the future of ownership? I mean, you have to get the word out a lot more. People need to be made aware of the consequences of the types of schemes that they're being forced into, in terms and conditions, et cetera. So,
well, Richard, your audience is a technology audience. It's a science audience, and that's the audience that we're very much hoping to reach, which is having people realize that ownership itself is one of the technologies as important as the technologies that they use in their work. And once people realize that it's a technology and it's one that's subject to our control, then we can begin to do something about it. Talking with you is exactly how we hope to get the word out.
Or do you see a more dystopian future in terms of ownership?
This sounds a bit corny. I think it's up to us. There are always going to be owners of scarce resources who want to maximize something. It may be political power, it may be wealth. They're going to tell their story. And I think the main takeaway from our book is that there are other stories that are out there that may be equally valid, that may be more valid, but you've got to identify what the stories are. And if we want to push for a more fair or more just society, then we're going to have to choose counter story to push back. We've talked a lot today about clickstream. We could have talked about wealth inequality. We could have talked about climate change. These are all ownership stories. We don't think about these as ownership stories, but they are.
Well, very good. James, Michael, tell me about the book. So it's March 2nd it's coming out, called Mine.
That's right. March 2nd it's coming out. We have a website that's up and running, www.minethebook.com. And we have a lot of free resources on there that are responsive to what we're talking about today. The ebook on digital ownership is one that we have on there for free, but we also have other resources as well. Yeah, we hope your readers buy the book. We hope your readers at least download the ebook. We want to get the word out to people.
Okay. Well, very good. Any last questions that you want me to bring up, or things you want to point out?
No, I think you did a great job sort of identifying what the key points are. And you know, when one focuses on ownership, the world looks different. I mean, it really, once you see it, you can't unsee it.
It is like the Matrix.
And once you see it, you can change it. And that's really our message in a nutshell.
True. Well, very good. James, Michael, thank you for coming. I really appreciate it.
Thanks so much.
Pleasure to be here.
If you like this podcast, please click the link in the description to subscribe and review us on iTunes.
You've been listening to the Finding Genius podcast with Richard Jacobs. If you like what you hear, be sure to review and subscribe to the Finding Genius podcast on iTunes or wherever you listen to podcasts. And want to be smarter than everybody else? Become a premium member at findinggeniuspodcast.com. This podcast is for information only. No advice of any kind is being given. Any action you take or don't take as a result of listening is your sole responsibility. Consult professionals when advice is needed.